Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα. Θα ήθελα να σας καλωσορίσω στην υποψινή εκδήλωση της παρουσίασης του βιβλίου του Γιώργου Παπακωνσταντίνου «Game Over, η αλήθεια για την κρίση». Και θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω εκ μέρους των Εκδόσεων Παπαδόπουλος για την παρουσία σας εδώ. Πρόκειται για ένα σημαντικό βιβλίο, καθώς είναι η πρώτη προσωπική μαρτυρία που κυκλοφορεί σε βιβλίο ενός από τους κύριους πρωταγωνιστές αυτής της δραματικής περίοδου. Δεν έχω να πω κάτι άλλο. Θα δώσω τώρα το μικρόφωνο στον κύριο Τσίμα για να ξεκινήσει η παρουσίαση. Ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Λοιπόν, ας χρησιμοποιήσω την καρέκλα του συντονιστή. Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα. Πίτερ, Γιώργο Παπουλάτο, κύριο Παπακωνσταντίνου, καλησπέρα σε όλους σας. Ο Γιώργος Παπακωνσταντίνου μου ζήτησε να βοηθήσω στο συντονισμό αυτής της απόψινής βραδιάς. Δεν ξέρω αν χρειάζεται, αλλά η πρόσκληση ήταν τιμητική. Παρ' όλα αυτά, αν δεν είχα διαβάσει το βιβλίο, θα το σκεφτόμουν 2 και 3 φορές πριν πω ναι. Αλλά είχα διαβάσει το βιβλίο όταν μου τηλεφώνησε και γι' αυτό είπα ναι αμέσως. Το λέω χωρίς να χρειάζεται τη δική μου συμβολή στην διαφήμισή του το βιβλίο, γιατί είναι ήδη μια μικρή εκδοτική επιτυχία. Όπως ξέρετε, είναι ήδη στη δεύτερη έκδοσή του και σήμερα κυκλοφορεί και μπορείτε να βρείτε και την αγγλική του έκδοση, η οποία φαντάζομαι ενδιαφέρει εκτός από τον εκδότη, εκτός από τον συγγραφέα, προφανώς ενδιαφέρει και τον κύριο Γιούνκερ, διότι προφανώς παίρνει δικαιώματα από τον τίτλο του βιβλίου. Είναι εκδοτική επιτυχία και αναρωτιέμαι, ή μάλλον προσπαθώ να καταλάβω γιατί. Νομίζω για 3 λόγους. Ο ένας λόγος είναι το πρόσωπο του συγγραφέα. Δεν είναι συνηθισμένο στα δικά μας πολιτικά ήθη ένα δημόσιο πρόσωπο που έχει ζήσει, έχει εμπλακεί, έχει πρωταγωνιστήσει σε ένα μεγάλο πολιτικό δράμα και φυσικά ο ρόλος του είναι, όπως όλων, αμφιλεγόμενος, τόσο γρήγορα, όταν ακόμα τα πράγματα είναι θερμά, όχι μετά από δεκαετίες για τους ιστορικούς του μέλλοντος, αλλά ενώ το δράμα συνεχίζει να εξελίσσεται και η συζήτηση είναι ανοιχτή, προσφέρει τη δική του εκδοχή των γεγονότων. Ακόμη κανείς και αν έχει αντίρρηση στον τρόπο με τον οποίο τα αφηγείται, ακόμα και αν τον κατηγορήσει ότι κάποια σημεία τα ωρεοποιεί ή κάποια άλλα σημεία τα αφήνει στο σκοτάδι, δεν μπορεί παρά να αναγνωρίσει ότι αυτό είναι κάτι πολύτιμο για όλους μας και είναι και κάτι, θα έλεγα, αν μου επιτρέπετε το όρος, γενναίο από την πλευρά του. Και με αυτή την έννοια χαίρομαι πολύ ως πολίτης και ως δημοσιογράφος που το κάνει. Και από καρδιάς τον συγχαίρω γι' αυτό. Ο δεύτερος λόγος που εξηγεί την επιτυχία είναι το βιβλίο το ίδιο, γιατί όσοι το έχουν διαβάσει θα συμφωνήσουν μαζί μου, είναι ένα βιβλίο ασυνήθιστα καλογραμμένο για βιβλίο πολιτικού προσώπου. Υιοθετεί ένα ύφος εξομολόγησης, αφήγησης, κάτι σαν προσωπικό ημερολόγιο, δεν κάνει μια θεωρητική ανάλυση για την εμπειρία του ως ο Υπουργός Οικονομικών που είχε την τρομερή ατυχία να υπογράψει το πρώτο μνημόνιο και να προσπαθήσει να το εφαρμόσει, αφηγείται τα γεγονότα, όπως εκείνος τα έζησε και φυσικά με τη δική του προσωπική εκδοχή. Και αυτό το κάνει ένα βιβλίο πολύ ευανάγνωστο. Ο τρίτος λόγος που εξηγεί την επιτυχία νομίζω ότι είμαστε εμείς οι αναγνώστες. Μπορεί να κάνω λάθος, αλλά έχω την αίσθηση ότι ένας κύκλος έχει κλείσει και νομίζω ότι σιγά σιγά το κοινό αίσθημα, αφού καταναλώσαμε επί 5-6 χρόνια τόνους εμπείρετης μυσαλλοδοξίας, πολλή προπαγάνδα από όλες τις πλευρές, πολλές θεωρίες συνωμοσίας, τώρα πια, καθώς ένας πρώτος κύκλος έκλεισε, νομίζω ότι όλο και περισσότεροι άνθρωποι έχουν την ανάγκη να ξαναεπισκεφθούμε αυτά τα γεγονότα, να τα ξανασκεφτούμε, να ακούσουμε όλες τις εκδοχές αυτής της ιστορίας, για να καταλάβουμε τι μας συνέβη, πώς φτάσαμε ως εδώ, αλλά και για να πάρουμε λίγο κουράγιο για την συνέχεια. Νομίζω λοιπόν και για τους 3 αυτούς λόγους, και για το πρόσωπο του συγγραφέα και το ρόλο που έπαιξε, και για το ίδιο το βιβλίο και τον τρόπο που είναι γραμμένο, αλλά νομίζω και για την στιγμή που έρχεται, για τη στιγμή που μας βρίσκει εμάς τους μέλλοντες ή ήδη αναγνώστες του, για αυτούς τους 3 λόγους το βιβλίο έχει ήδη κάνει μια πολύ πετυχημένη καριέρα στα βιβλιοπωλεία και νομίζω ότι θα κάνει κι άλλο. Απόψε η βραδιά θα έχει δύο μέρη. Σε ένα πρώτο μέρος θα ακούσουμε τις εισαγωγικές παρατηρήσεις των δύο ανθρώπων που θα μιλήσουν για το βιβλίο. Ο ένας είναι πάρα πολύ γνωστός μας, ο Peter Spiegel. Είναι ένας άνθρωπος που, όπως μου έλεγε, ο μόνος που έχει ζήσει την ελληνική κρίση λίγο περισσότερο από εκείνον είναι ο Wolfgang Schäuble, γιατί είχε αναλάβει υπουργός οικονομικών στη Γερμανία λίγους μήνες πριν ο Πίτερ πάει στις Βρυξέλλες και είναι ακόμη εκεί, ενώ ο Πίτερ τώρα έχει φύγει και έχει πάει στο Λονδίνο. Ο δεύτερος είναι ο Γιώργος Παπακωνσταντίνος, καθηγητής, γνωστός σε όλους μας. Δίσταζα αν πρέπει να σας αποκαλύψω τη δεύτερη πράξη της απόψινής παράστασης. Παρ' όλα αυτά, στην δεύτερη πράξη, ένας ομότεχνος του Γιώργου Παπακωνσταντίνου, ένας συγγραφέας δηλαδή, ο Χρήστος Κομενίδης, θα μιλήσει μαζί του, φαντάζομαι με διαφορετικό τρόπο από ό,τι θα μιλήσουμε εμείς οι τρεις. Λοιπόν, με αυτά, δίνω αμέσως το λόγο στον Peter Spiegel. Peter, please.
Thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to be back in Athens. It is, despite the opinion of the current government, perhaps, I always feel very welcome here. And occasionally the current government welcomes me back as well. So I do want to say thank you in all seriousness. I have been coming to Greece off and on now for 6 years for work. And in all seriousness, despite the trauma this country has gone through, almost every government, PASOK, New Democracy, and indeed even Syriza, has always welcomed me here. And it's also actually been the people I've met here and become friends with who have welcomed me here every time I come that's made it such a worthwhile coming back. I also want to say a special thank you to George. George and I first met, I guess, when I was covering him as finance minister, but it was sort of a very professional relationship. I was one of the guys in the press conference throwing questions at him, and we actually didn't get to know each other much better until George had left office. And let's be honest, for a foreigner, for an outsider to understand Greek politics can be rather challenging. And both George and his wife Jacqueline have been incredibly kind to me to sort of give me guidance every once in a while when I don't understand what's going on here, and it's not just the language I get confused with. That said, I want to start talking about the book on page 131. And that's in the English version, which the joke I always say, but no one laughs. The English version is much better than the Greek version. So. And I wanted to start there. There's a scene that really struck me that got to the core of why I think this book is important. And it's a scene right after the Prime Minister requests the program from the Europeans and the IMF. And George walks across Syntagma Square to the finance ministry for his first press conference. And there is a British reporter who asks him, how does it feel to be the most hated man in Greece? And in the book, he says, it hits me like a punch in the stomach. And the reason this phrase in this section struck me is, as a reporter over the last 6 years, I've been trying to find out and ask the same question. Why is it in the current Greek environment, both George and George Papandreou are seen as the devils in this story? And I never really understood it, to be honest with you, and I don't to this day. I'll tell you an anecdote. The last time I was here in Athens, I was doing some reporting on the leadership election in New Democracy. And I was talking to some officials, and they said it's basically two factions within New Democracy. You have the Mitsotakis faction, and you have the Karmelis faction, which is complicated by the fact that half the Mitsotakis family is on the other side. But, and I said, the Karmelis faction, Kostas Karmelis is still powerful enough in New Democracy that he can have a faction? Why is it that Papandreou and Papakonstantino are the devils, but Kostas Karmelis is somehow still able to have influence in New Democracy? It really struck me as it's been, I know there's some of you in the room I've had this conversation with. And the reason I hear most frequently is one that George deals with in the book, which is the campaign promise, there is more money. Now, I've heard this repeated to me several times, that this is an irresponsible promise, that the Prime Minister knew at the time, the party leader knew at the time that things were looking bad. I find this unconvincing, and I'll tell you for a couple reasons. Number one, as sins go in politics, it's a pretty mild one, and during a campaign promising to spend. The other thing, which I think is more important, which I think people forget, is that who predicted in 2009 that a large budget deficit in Greece would lead to the near end of the euro? Certainly no one in Brussels knew that. The markets didn't know this. The economists didn't know this. And not wise guys like me reporting on this. I didn't know it. So to assume that this one phrase in a campaign is the reason that the Papa-Constantino regime is viewed as the enemy number one, that never really held water for me. So why? What's the reason? And I think this is why this book is frankly so important to the current dialogue we're having in Europe, but also particularly in Greece. Because I always felt that there is this myth that if only a Greek government had negotiated better, that somehow things would turn out different. But I think, as George points out here, and I love the phrase, at least in English, TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. And I really genuinely believe that. Not just through Greece, but I have seen and followed and covered 4 other bailouts: Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Cyprus. And every government comes in and says, I am not going to be like the Greeks. I am going to negotiate. And I remember distinctly with the Spanish program, because the Spanish, we're a big country. We don't get bossed around by Brussels. And I got a call from our Madrid bureau chief saying, the Spanish government is outraged. How dare they lecture to Spain that they must do these measures? And I said, welcome to the eurozone crisis. And I think this mythology has, to be honest with you, has really been a disease in the Greek political class and been very, very dangerous and destructive. George describes in the book how very early on he tried, and the account he tells here has been backed up by many people I talked to, tried to get the Europeans to move. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in here is the first time you showed up in Berlin. And Angela Merkel says, well, Wolfgang and I disagree on this, whether you're going to the program. Now, we all knew as reporters there was disagreements in the finance ministry and the chancellor, but to actually openly admit it to the prime minister and the finance minister of Greece goes to the point that they were delaying and they couldn't decide. And they didn't want to do a backstop, and then the size of the backstop, and the ECB didn't want to do restructuring. But the thing that I found most striking is, very quickly, George realized, Tina, there is no other alternative. We must sue for peace and get the best deal we can. But this disease spread, I would say, starting with Venizelos. The line you would get out of Venizelos when I would talk to him is, you know what, if there was a better negotiator in there, things would have been different. And he shows up, as George describes, at his first Eurogroup meeting. It was actually in Luxembourg, though. It wasn't in Brussels, because I was there. And he gives this long speech. Yesterday is over. There's a new man in town. I'm going to negotiate a new second bailout, because most of the second bailout had been negotiated under George. And Olli Rehn, who most of you may not know, at the time was the economic commissioner, he is quite possibly the most mild-mannered Finn you've ever met. They always have this joke, how do you tell an extrovert Finn from an introvert? The extrovert looks at your shoes when he talks, and the introvert looks like his own shoes. He turned to Venizelos and screamed at him, do you want this money or not? This is not a negotiation. Now, to his great credit, much like George, Venizelos quickly realized, Tina, there is no alternative, and signed on essentially to the program that George had negotiated. But there was still this lingering belief that he could negotiate another deal. It infected, after Venizelos, I would argue, Samaras. As the leader of the opposition, what was his argument? If only New Democracy was there to negotiate, we could have a better deal. This was the argument, and again, as George describes, the opposition in Ireland, the opposition in Portugal never did this. They were national unity governments, not national unity governments, but both the opposition and the government agreed to move forward together. But Samaras had this, again, this myth that somehow he could negotiate a better deal. Well, what happens with Samaras when he gets into office? 2 weeks? Suddenly, he embraces the program as his own. I write about this in one of the pieces I wrote about the crisis. Barroso flies to Athens and says, you have to stop saying you're going to tear up the memorandum. Merkel is going to cut you off. And he literally changes his speech that he's going to give with Barroso. Again, a smart politician, much like Venizelos, realized very quickly, Tina, there is no alternative. Now, the tragedy of Greece, or the recent tragedy of Greece, This disease clearly also infected Tsipras. But it infected Tsipras in a different way, in that, I would argue, he believed he could get a better deal if only he could show Brussels that we were standing for the Greek people and I had the backing of the Greek people, and he didn't learn this lesson for 6 months. Whereas George and Venizelos and Samaras learned it in days, if not weeks. It took him 6 months to learn this lesson. 6 months that were incredibly damaging to this country, I would argue. Now, he learned the lesson. He learned the lesson because he did sign the same memorandum that was on the table for 6 months, even though he got his Oshi. But it was 6 very damaging months. Now, I want to make clear that this is not a system I think is particularly fair. It is not a system that I find to be democratic, and it is not a system that I would have built had I been in charge of the eurozone. But we live in the world as it is, not in the world as we want it to be. And the world as it is, let's be blunt, is a eurozone in which the Germans dominate. And I would argue another reason I find this argument that George, the two Georges, that the Papandreou and Papa-Constantino are so wrongly criticized is because what went wrong with the program in the Papandreou government had nothing to do with the Papandreou government. It had everything to do with the way Europe managed. I was joking with George as I was reading the book. I sent him an email. I said, every book about the eurozone crisis has to have a chapter called Deauville. Deauville, for those who didn't follow this, was a famous meeting between Angela Merkel and then President Sarkozy in the seaside resort, where Sarkozy didn't bring his economic advisors because it was supposed to be a foreign policy debate. They were meeting the president of Russia at the time, Medvedev. And Merkel convinced him that in 2013, we should have a new bailout fund. And the rules of the new bailout fund said if you need a bailout, you'd force losses on bondholders. Now, to the German government, apparently, and to maybe most outsiders, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But let's remember what a bailout is about. A bailout is about the Greek government could not afford to pay its bills, and the international community stepping in saying, don't worry, we will pay you back. We are here to pay Greece's debts. Then 6 months later, the Chancellor of Germany says, yeah, we'll pay Greece's debts, but in 2013, maybe we won't. What kind of message does that send to the financial markets? If I'm an owner of a bond, any eurozone bond, which says I'm going to pay you back, and let's be honest, everyone has this theory that these Anglo-Saxon conspirators are wheeling and dealing bonds. Bonds tend to be owned by little old ladies in pension funds because they are secure investments. If I thought this was a secure investment and the Chancellor of Germany just told me you're not going to pay me back, what do? I sell. So at the time we are trying to get Greece back in the market, the Chancellor of Germany says you're not going to get paid back. Not only that, if you own any eurozone bond, you may not get paid back. What happens? They all sell. Ireland can't fund itself. Portugal can't fund itself. Spain almost couldn't fund itself, and Italy almost couldn't fund itself. My point in telling this story is, how is George Papandreou and George Papa-Constantino to blame for Angela Merkel setting the bond market on fire? They are not. And this, to me, is the central quandary that I have about the narrative of the eurozone crisis. There is this belief that it is always the Greek government's fault. My argument is, yes, did George Papandreou make mistakes? I think he would acknowledge he did, and George, you also acknowledge he made mistakes. I think Antonis Samaras, in my conversation with him, has admitted he made mistakes. I would hope that Alexis Tsipras would acknowledge he made mistakes. But what went from a garden variety, run-of-the-mill debt crisis to setting the world on fire was not because of the Greek government. It was because of the way it was managed in Brussels and Berlin. I think just one last point on this before I know I'm already over time. We saw this again this week. The fact of the matter is there was a Eurogroup meeting on Tuesday, and for months the IMF said, I will not agree to a deal until two things happen: debt relief and the budget targets are lowered. And I believe that the IMF was going to walk away. The Greek government, the IMF, and the German government walk into a room, the Germans come out winning. There is no debt relief. There is no change in fiscal targets. This happens time and again. There was a promise in 2018 of debt relief. If you remember, Antonis Samaras got a promise of debt relief in November 2012 that never came. Tsipras himself got a promise of debt relief last year that apparently never came. And now we have another promise in 2018. The Germans run Europe. for good or for ill. One last story, and then I'll wrap. It's not a Greece story. It's a British story, but it gets to this point. If you remember about 2 years ago, there was a controversy about whether Jean-Claude Juncker should be president of the European Commission. And the leading opponent was David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister. And he had a promise from Angela Merkel that she would block him. Well, when the day came, Merkel did not live up to her promise, mostly because of domestic politics. There was a faction within her party that supported Juncker. She didn't want to anger her faction of her party to keep solidarity with them. So she said, sorry, David, you pay the price. And the next day, I was at a cocktail party, and a very senior British official who was working at Downing Street at the time, who I had met and worked with quite a bit, saw me across the room and ushered me over and said, Peter, everyone says that Germany dominates Europe. But you know what really dominates Europe? German domestic politics. And I turned to him and I said, well, I said his name, but I won't say his name now. I said, sir, welcome to the eurozone crisis. Remember, as George tells in his book, the reason the first Greek bailout, one of the reasons the first Greek bailout was delayed was because there was a regional election in North Rhine-Westphalia. The fact that Europe stopped and burned, and Greece sat and burned and had to borrow so much more money was so Merkel could have a success in a regional election. I find that to be a bit troubling. Lastly, I wanted to, this time I really wrap up. Another thing I find that this adds to the conversation, and it's a bit of the elephant in the room, so I would think it would be remiss if I didn't address it, is the last 2 chapters on the Lagarde list. Now, I cannot talk with any knowledge about the Lagarde list. I did not cover the case. I did not cover the instance. I find, however, that the rest of the book is incredibly credible. It supports everything I know about the eurozone crisis. So George's explanation, last 2 chapters, I would find incredibly, would share of that credibility. The other thing I will say, though, George, is that in talking to almost everyone who has worked in this crisis, including people who would be considered enemies of Greece, everyone always says about what a man of personal integrity he is and how he worked tirelessly for 2 years to try to better this country. And I have found it troubling that this country has descended into what we call in America the politics of personal destruction. The fact that both sides now engage in rhetoric that is reminiscent of a civil war, frankly, that you were either a leftist or a fascist, and that the lines are being drawn not just in Greece sometimes, but elsewhere in Europe as well, is very dangerous, not only to Greece, but I think to the European project. And so I would hope that people would read the bit about the Lagarde list and think about what that trial had, the impact it had on not only George, but his family, and try to think a bit about how we practice politics in Europe, and I would say my country as well, the United States. Because if we continue down this path of making it personal and criminalizing or attacking decent individuals for policy mistakes, I think we go down a very, very dangerous path. With that, I turn it back to you.
Thank you. Before I turn to George, just this silly what-if question. What if Deauville hadn't happened? How do you think things would have played out? I mean, would the first Greek bailout program run smoothly for 2 or 3 years and then Greece return happily to the markets, or
Let me tell you an anecdote in that regard. I was, before I moved to Brussels, I was a war correspondent. I covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for American newspapers. And we had a baby, and my wife said, none of this, stop. And I got a call from the Financial Times, and they said, would you like to be the Brussels bureau chief? And I saw this Greek story, and I said, fantastic, sign me up. And I arrived in Brussels August 2010, and I began to panic because the Greece crisis was over. George writes, when do we know the crisis is over? When it's out of the front page of the Financial Times. I did not write a Greece story for the first 6 months to a year. I'll have to go back and check. I think it was almost a year because the program was working. It was not perfect. There was domestic fighting that George gets into. None of these programs are perfect, but they were progressing like Ireland did, like Portugal did, and eventually got out in 3 years. So I actually do believe that confidence was returning, and confidence is such an ephemeral thing. You know, why does suddenly someone loan you money and someone suddenly doesn't? As George points out, Japan has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 200%. But people think the Japanese can pay it back. Why? Well, it's confidence. Confidence was returning to the Greek economy. Investors were beginning to think about it again. So I actually do believe, had Deauville not happened, it would have been tough, it would have been hard, like any other IMF program, but it would have been a run-of-the-mill IMF program. It wouldn't have been what it became, which is almost bringing down the global economy.
Okay, thanks a lot.